think we started on concepts, and now we got to get down to reality. And the thing is, there's so much reality to talk about now.
Yeah, there's a lot. This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Maryam, Pasha, the director and curator at TEDxLondon and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie.
This is a conversation, I would say, like almost 2 years in the making, because in 2021, Josie and I and Ben were at TED Countdown in Edinburgh, and Josie and I got to go to a workshop with you, John.
Oh,
and
right.
What?
Yeah,
Where was I? What was I doing?
You were not there. You
What
were doing
the
something
heck?
else. You did this.
Sleeping, taking a nap. I was napping.
And I think that in that workshop, we turned to each other, Josie, who is our producer, and said, "We've got to get John on the podcast." But
A whisper.
so, like, 2 years later, we've got you. We're here at Climate Week in New York. It's also the UN General Assembly. There's lots happening. There's meetings. There's buzz. And so thank you for taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to actually start by having you tell us who you are, because much like Ben and I, you are not someone who spent their whole life working in climate, but it's something that you really focus on and are making, like, I would say, I would say, you know, it's something that you're really focused on now and in a major way. Like, this is your whole thing. So tell me a bit about your background.
Yeah, I was a business guy for 30 years, and
Boo, boo. No, joking.
so I was working with all these big companies, some of whom might be polluters, but we're not going to talk about that too much. So I worked as a management consultant and a marketing executive, working for, you know, the big brands in your fridges and your driveways, and trying to get people to buy them and buy more cookies and buy more credit cards. So and then my son, I've got 3 boys, and my son came home one day. He was taking a course at school about climate change, and he said, "Dad, you're not doing shit about climate change. You're selling shoes, or you know, like, there's something more important out there."
It's always the kids. It's always the kids.
And so he pulled out an ad from an organization I will not name and said, "This isn't working." And he said, "You're in this business." And so he literally locked me in the house for a couple of days and said, "I want you to call all your friends who are in the marketing business, all the big advertising executives, and I want you to see what you can do." And so, and of course, my wife was in the room at the same time. She's like, "Yeah, you got to do this." So we, it sort of started this cascade of, like, phoning people up and saying, "Hey, if we brought better, you know, if we started using the same tools and techniques that we have on in the commercial world to actually get people to care about the issue, would it work?" So that kind of caused me to leave all of that behind and start this nonprofit, which is called Potential Energy. So we think of ourselves kind of as the marketing firm for planet Earth, trying to basically, how do you get the 8 billion of us to care more so that we do more? But I'm kind of a nerd, and so we basically using all this data that we're gathering to figure out, in the same way we would, you know, if we're selling some car or something like that,
Right.
how would we get people to care more about the issue? So 4 years later, we've served, to many people out there, we've served and measured about 3 billion ads, and so we're watching what you're all clicking on. And,
Wow. You're the people.
but we're using it for good.
Oh my gosh. I didn't know that those people were actually people that are watching. That's so weird.
We're taking that skill that can be used for evil, and we're trying to use it for good, and we're observing what people care about, and we're testing different messages, and we're trying to figure out how to get more people in the climate movement.
So cool, man. This really speaks to the power of a forced lock-in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As a
I
kid.
love that's what Ben takes away from it, is lock people in a room
Lock
and make them
them
solve
in.
the
It
problem.
was a vivid weekend.
Yeah.
So you've been doing this now for 3-4 years.
Yep.
You've been testing these messages. I mean, that's a lot of data points that you have. I'm curious, for people who really haven't thought about the idea of climate communications, where are we at right now? What is the state of the conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think a few decades ago, a lot of policymakers and scientists sort of figured it out, and so they dominated all the little frameworks that got created, and we got stuck with them. Like, we get stuck with decarbonization and net zero and GHG emissions, and no one knows. Turns out no one knows what those mean.
What is GHG emissions? Do I know
greenhouse
that?
gases?
Oh, right.
Greenhouse gases.
I know that one.
So I just did a global poll of a representative sample of 6 billion people on planet Earth, and so we asked them, what is the UN's target for an acceptable temperature increase, because everyone here at Climate Week is like 1.5 degrees, and the average person thinks that an acceptable target is 4 degrees centigrade.
What?
Okay, we are really baking at 4 degrees centigrade.
That's like game over, right? That's 4 degrees is finished.
Well, I got to translate it into Fahrenheit for here, but it's a lot. It's a lot.
Wow.
And then we it's fun to look at the data, because we know in every country throughout the world what people think, and it turns out that the Germans are the most accurate. 24% of them know what the goal is.
24.
Somehow not surprising.
But the Brits and the Americans aren't doing quite as well. I think the Americans are like 1 out of 15 people know what the target is. So basically, all that kind of gibberish is not really helping get the 8 billion of us to rise up and do some stuff. So that's what we're working on.
So is it a case of like what's happened so far has increased people's awareness, or has it not increased awareness? Are we like failing on that front of like increasing awareness, or is it just the specificity of the details that we're missing?
I think awareness has gone up a lot, and caring has gone up a lot, and the desire for governments to do stuff has gone up a lot. But when you get right down to actually getting stuff done, people don't really understand what it is, and they don't know what to do, and they don't necessarily know how to support it. So you have 80% of the planet who thinks governments should do what is necessary to solve climate change. So that's a huge number of people, but they're not sure what comes next. And then when you talk about a law just passed for scope 1, 2, and 3 corporate disclosures, people are like, well, I don't know exactly what mouthwash I have. So we need them to get supportive of the actual stuff we're going to do. Conceptually, they're supportive of it, but when it comes down to what are we doing, and then our firm is trying to just make it real, make it for regular people, get people to connect with it, and get more people on board.
So, I want to ask about that, but I have a question that has been in my brain for a long time doing this work. A lot of the conversations I have with people who are deep in the climate work, is they talk a lot about we have to get people to care more.
Yeah.
And, being familiar with your research, seeing some of, what others have done as well, it feels like people care.
People care, yeah.
It's the what do we do about it, and who does that thing that feels like it's the hurdle.
Yeah. And I think us making it complicated has made it hard to get to the next step.
Right.
People do care, and they care a lot because they just notice it, right? And they see what's happening in their lives and outdoors, and in Libya and Hawaii and so forth. So they're definitely caring a lot more
now, right?
But there's so many things that they're told to do, like hundreds and hundreds of do this with your diet, and do this with your car, and do this with your recycling, and do things with your plastic. And so I think a big part of we got to simplify this a lot in order for people to be able to get behind it. And so that's kind of what we're trying to figure out.
So, in terms of that simplification, can you give us some examples of kind of what you've been testing and what's been working out there in the world?
Yeah.
So wait, are you running, just to clarify, are you running tests on like how people are responding to campaigns?
Yeah. Well, we have kind of a big persuasion machine, as it were, that is running ads and running tests and running basically measurable media. The same kind of thing I would do if I was trying to sell you a credit card.
Right.
Climate. So we've done.
Will you actually talk us through? Because I don't think people understand how that process really works.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Well, it's kind of basically the exact same thing as companies, right? So you do a bunch of research on population. You figure out what people care about. You create segments, and then you develop a whole series of messages against those groups. Like it might be moms, it might be steel workers, it might be rural populations, and you test a whole bunch of different things, and then you find out, you watch what happens, you find out what they care about, and then you use those messages. And so it's like 100% data-driven approach to get people to care more about it. And it turns out that's a very efficient way to make money as a company, and the same thing actually works for climate. So that's what we do.
Mums, steel workers, and rural communities, the cornerstones, the cornerstones of society.
The fun thing about doing it is that you discover things about life too.
Right.
Like I was quoted in the New Yorker in an article a couple of years ago because the data has basically told us that men are largely useless on climate. And so every single test that we've done, we increase action among women about twice as much, or almost twice as much as men. And so I'm not sure why that is, but the data gives us clues.
We'll figure it out. We're in the process.
Yeah, well, I would be fascinated to know why that is. Tell us one thing. Tell us a bit more. So tell us what you've tested and tell us kind of what you've been finding.
Well, I think the easy part is that the usual gibberish doesn't necessarily get people that excited. Like no one wakes up in the morning and says it's a great day for decarbonization. And then
I wake up in the morning.
We've come up with concepts which I think in Europe are a little more prevalent, but that aren't really very well known, like net zero. And like, who wants to go to zero? I don't want to go to zero. I don't even know what net zero is. So those things, obviously those things don't really connect with your average person. We did a test in Florida. We tried to get a whole bunch of people to like join the sign petitions and so forth, and get to 100% or get to net zero by 2030 or whatever is about 4 times more expensive as stop my flooding problem. And so it's kind of obvious, but what we actually need to do is
stop my flooding.
Talk about stuff that people actually care about.
Yeah, it's interesting because now that you say that, it does make me think that I don't know if I've heard of a climate campaign that sounds like I wrote it. Do you know what I mean? Like one that sounds like it's relevant for my demographic. So if I think of like 30-something adults, I don't know if I've heard anything that makes me think, oh yeah, I should actually pay attention to that. I think it's often been the conversations around it
like that have got me engaged.
Yeah. That have got me engaged, but never the actual messaging or branding. Net zero is a really interesting one. I've never thought of that. Like, what does that? Obviously, now I know what it means, but before I knew, I wouldn't have ever thought, oh yeah, that sounds enticing or appealing in any way. Yeah.
Here's a funny one. I don't know how big ESG is. If anyone in your audience has heard of ESG.
What is ESG?
So there's a big thing. There's a big thing in America about ESG now,
in Europe too.
And in Europe, and there's a new campaign that's come out against ESG called woke capitalism.
So ESG is economic, social, and society,
environmental,
social, and governance.
So it's a super big concept in the corporate sector and in the investing sector,
right.
And now it's become a political fight in the U.S. And so we got interested in that, and it violates all of our principles because no one knows. It turns out 26% of people have even heard about it. So we did a poll on ESG, which is like a big term that climate people use, and it turns out, and we asked, what does it mean? And the number one answer had the word eggs in it.
I even thought it was economic. So
eggs, sausage, and grits, or something like that.
Delicious breakfast. That's what we're talking about. Yeah. These are the real issues that we need to be tackling.
Yeah.
And sometimes, do you get this sense when you are working with people who are in climate that there's a real I feel this sometimes. What's the word? They're really tied to these terms. They're really tied to this terminology. Like they've almost fought so hard to get it that the idea of letting go feels like they're somehow giving up.
I think so. Well, also, like here we are on Climate Week. We've had all these meetings. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of positive energy, and it really feels like we're making progress. And the legislature in California just passed climate disclosure legislation, and so we're very excited. That's like a big win for the people who are in climate.
Right.
And climate disclosure legislation doesn't really mean that much, but like stop the cover up on pollution is a good way to do that, right? And so we should get excited about that because it actually is a way that you could actually talk to people and it can be relevant to them. So it's a pretty small bubble. We did about 50% of people claim to have heard of the Paris Accord. Well, most of them are lying. It's probably more like 25%. But even like
people just want to sound like they know what. The
Paris Accord. But 50% of people are willing to say I've never even heard of it. So here in New York, we're talking about the Paris Accord a great deal, and it doesn't really work very well.
So what things have you found like actually work for? If you take like the demographic, for example, of mums, might not be a good one, but like a demographic of mums, is there? Because obviously, like if I go on YouTube for whatever, I have targeted ads, right? Like they're targeting me with things that are relevant to what I am interested in, what I watch. Have you developed data sets about like what the things are that actually work for those groups of people?
We have, and mums are one that we talk to all the time because they care a lot and they move a lot and they do a lot and they typically get involved in lots of social movements, and, whether it's gun violence or drunk driving or seatbelt laws and so forth. So the moms are usually in the forefront. So we do a lot with moms. And we found that had a funny epiphany the other day. We looked at all the data. And, there's these debates. So should it be about fear? No, you should be about hope. Should it be about sacrifice? No, you should be about abundance. All these, and so we run all these ads. And it turns out that none of it's right. The thing that works the best with moms is actually love.
Wow.
Because like taking care of your kids is a primary motivator. And so people get motivated by that.
Well, tell us more about this. This is so
Threaten them with their children and then they will be
So love is
love for your kids, and we want to take care of them.
Nice.
And yes, and so fear, optimism, hope, joy, all those other things, they're kind of part of love. You know what I mean? Like sometimes I'm worried for my kids, and sometimes I'm hopeful, and sometimes I'm joyful. And so we're trying to figure out how do you tap into things that really matter to people. And so to get to moms, you really talk, what can you do to take care of your kids? Because that's the thing that they think about a lot, and how can you get involved? And that tends to really get people way more engaged than the promise of green jobs in your economic community. And climate change attracts all these amazingly smart people, right? And there's just, because it's so hard, so you have to be like fearless in the face of something that's really hard. So a lot of people come into climate who are very, very bright, and then they try and communicate in a way that's very, very bright. And, so like global competitive advantage and all those kinds of things. But people just want to take care of their kids, or make sure they can still fish, or have the vacation spots that they like.
So interesting. So obviously half of this is about the messaging, right? Like it's about like the actual things that we're saying to people to communicate why they should care or do care and don't realize that they care.
Yeah.
Does the messenger have any impact on that? Like, is it like, does it matter who's saying those things to those people, or is it just it doesn't make any difference?
Yeah, it matters a lot. And I think the biggest problem of all is that if you did a pie chart of the messengers, 90% of them would be politicians. And so we've picked the least, the least trusted humans on earth to talk about the most important problem. And so
relevant as we're here in New York and the UN General
If they just
Assembly.
didn't talk as much about it, we would be much better off. We need doctors, we need moms and doctors and farmers and fishermen and regular folks to talk more about it. But it is, there's way too much. And, the data basically says an ad with a politician in it will perform about a tiny fraction of like someone who you can relate to. So,
really?
Yeah.
That's super interesting.
We need them. We need them to make the change, but we need them to quiet down.
So here's a question. You just alluded to it as we research, as the team goes through the research. The message of love is highly effective with across all your segments or moms?
Pretty much across anything.
Really? I can't believe that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No.
It's kind of bigger than it's kind of bigger than politics. The message of love actually gets conservatives to really care more about climate change, because it's the one thing that we actually share. So.
Okay, so this is what I wanted to ask: is so love is universal, which is actually lovely,
beautiful.
Yeah. But there must be messages that have. I just know this. So when I used to work in immigration, the messages that really worked for people who were like supportive of migrants' rights really turned everyone else in the other direction, and the messages that worked for like the center and the center right really pissed off people on the left.
Yeah.
Is it similar here?
Oh, totally. Yeah, there's a lot of messages that for every person you gain, you lose somebody a lot, and a lot of ones that get used. In the U.S., I call those climate-y messages. What do I mean?
Okay.
Climate's actually not an adjective, as it turns out. It's a noun. And so we've invented this really useless phrase, climate change, that we're stuck with.
Right.
We should have called it the pollution blanket or overheating or something that people are going to mention. But we're stuck with that. We've been stuck with that for a while. So we've got climate this, you go around here and there's climate this, climate that, climate action, climate jobs, climate. And so that feels like a smaller thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas the planet's overheating because of pollution feels like a much bigger thing. And so
everybody's involved in that.
Everyone's involved. Yeah. And if there was one thing we learned about the whole thing, is just talk about pollution. Call it pollution. Don't call it emissions. Don't call it climate change. And it's, if you think about it, and this is what gets to like getting the average person's head into this, because if you ask the average person help fight climate change, they're like, oh no, how do I start? Can I have a difference? But if you say we're not fighting climate change, we're fighting the polluters who are causing climate change, that seems a lot easier, right? And so you say, 70 or 100 companies are responsible for 71% of the pollution that's overheating the earth. People are like, oh, we can do that. We can actually talk to those 100 companies. Someone can call them up and we can put regulations on it. So it makes people feel much more relaxed. You can like see it in the focus groups that you do when you say, well, there's a select number of organizations that do a tremendous amount of the pollution. If we deal with that, we can actually deal with the problem.
Yeah, because that's such a manageable goal, isn't it? Like that feels like an actual achievable target to just focus your energy and your attention on like 100 companies and be like, oh, let's just try and stop those guys from doing it. Yeah. And also to think about like how much pollution you're doing, which maybe is not the best way to, or maybe that's another part of the issue is that that messaging around stopping your own emissions and all of that kind of stuff is not as impactful.
It's an interesting point, because I was super curious about this, because if if people think that they're totally responsible for it, it feels a lot harder than if people think companies and oil companies are more responsible. So we just did this big global poll to try and figure out, like, which was it? Are people wandering around carrying the burden on their own and thinking, I should fly, I don't want to fly, but I want to get to see my niece or whatever?
Right.
It turns out that for every 100 people, this is across 23 countries, 22 of them think that individuals are the ones who should take the lead, but 78 of them think it should be companies and the government should take it should be big companies and all companies that should take the lead. And so pretty much the world realizes that we got to go after the big polluters in order to solve it. So I think we waste a lot of time thinking about the list of 100 things you want to do. Now, it is good to get people to do things in their own lives because it makes them feel engaged and so forth. But when I heard a smart comment that somebody made, like, if you're faced with the question, what should I do as an individual? The answer should be, stop being an individual.
Yes.
Go get some buddies together.
I've heard
Talk
this too.
to the school or talk to your city or whatever. So I think that's where we need to steer people to make it simpler. There are, I think, it's if you have let's say we'll make a little contest and we'll give you a pro climate message, and then we'll give you the slow down your climate-y stuff message.
Right.
Okay, so the pro climate message would be, we need to stop extraction of fossil fuels in order to fight climate change. Sounds pretty good. I think the Secretary General might have said that in the last couple of weeks. And the other message is, we need to gradually reduce emissions, and we're going to need fossil fuels in order to keep our prices low. Okay, so if you ask 6 billion people about that, which one do you think wins? The second one wins by about 20 points.
Because keep the prices low.
Keep the prices low.
Right.
And so gets back to the love thing a little bit. I've developed this new theory that we've kind of got like the better and the worse angels of our nature. Like, when there's like the immediacy and those kind of, maybe it's not the worst angels, but there's a bunch of stuff we need today, which we're kind of wired to do, and we consume more, and we want lower prices, and all those kinds of things. And then and that's like a baked in like genetic force, right? But there's other baked in genetic forces that we care for others, right? And that's like all species have that, which is a love thing. And so it's kind of a fight between the the 7 deadly sins in the Book of Virtues or something like that. Like, there's the love side of human nature? Does the caring for other side beat the immediate gratification side? And I do think the other side can do pretty well with it's going to cost you more. They're taking things away. They're limiting your freedom. There's a ban. There's a mandate. There's a blocker.
It's going to cost you.
It's going to cost you.
Yeah.
And so we do need to talk, in order to tip those scales, we actually need to talk about the winning on the other side, which is your kids gain more and society gains more, and you're going to have less pollution, and it's going to be more prosperous. And so, but we're fighting kind of the near-term thing, and that's the tricky part. And it's super easy to say it's going to cost you more. That actually works really well.
You know what it makes me think of is, there's that story around how we all have these 2 wolves inside, and it depends which wolf you feed
that's good.
that wins.
Yeah.
And the kind of, I'm going to call them like the delaying messages, they feed the negative, the selfish, individualistic, short-term negative wolf.
Yeah.
But the pro-climate messages, they don't feed the love wolf.
Yeah.
They just they don't do anything. And we haven't had enough messages that feed that other wolf, really.
We've tested a whole bunch of different taglines, and one that we use quite a lot, that we may use a lot more, is "later is too late." Because you've been.
I approve that one.
The reason I brought it up is that you mentioned delaying, and I think it's always possible to have both. Taking care of our families and taking care of the future, but also got to deal with today, and that's a real issue. But if you don't create some urgency, you don't face the reality of it. And I was thinking, it's kind of like my corporate world. Like, you've got to buy now message to us, right? Later is too late. You've got to actually go and do this now. And it also gets to the other problem we were talking about at the beginning, that like people aren't quite sure what to do. So you have to create a sense of, okay, we have to act now. Later is too late. We've got to really move on it. So that tends to work pretty well.
Yeah, because I imagine if you can sell life insurance, you can sell climate action, right? Like, if you can motivate people to do something in that regard of like, you can't do it later, you need to do it now. That same messaging must apply. Yeah. In lots of different ways.
You're totally right. And so what do marketers actually do? The ones who are making you buy things that you didn't think that you actually needed. They're coming up with a why. Yeah. Right. And so the reason you might buy a certain fashion product is that you want to be part of the group, or there's always a why
You
behind
want to
what
look
you
like
do.
Ben Hurst, really.
You do. So
It's possible. You can.
Yeah.
So we're on this like search for why, like how, because that's the unlock to climate change is you find the big why, which is why I think the kids and the love and the caring is a good place to go.
So here's a question, because we mentioned the polluters and this idea of going after them and these group of people. Does the idea of accountability then also resonate with people? Is that a message, this message of accountability, of that there are a group of people who we need to, or a group of companies? Does that work, or is that too negative? Is that going down the wrong path?
It works well. It doesn't work quite as well as the thing I talked about before, but I would say it's an important part of the mix. I think the way you hook people is the why, the reason. Why do I get engaged? And then then there's the what do we do about it?
Okay.
And we actually, what we found is that it's a little easier to talk about limiting pollution and polluters rather than eliminating an industry, like because there's real people who work in this industry,
right?
And they're just like us. They actually are, and they have real jobs and they have careers and they see things in different ways, and that's where the love thing comes in as well, because we got to care for them as we work through the transition. Right. And there's also a whole bunch of people who don't have the same energy that we have in the Northern Hemisphere, and we've got to care for them as well. And so I think polluter accountability works, but it needs to work in the context of a bigger reason that together we're actually moving to a better future, as opposed to just making it villainy. And if you just call out, like, eliminate an industry, you don't, and if you do that in, I don't know, Texas or different places, it's got a little tone deaf to the realities of a whole bunch of people who are getting their livelihood in Texas.
Yeah. It reminds me of part of so coming from the human rights world, which is all about people. One of the things that I felt so strongly when I started to work in climate was that we were so stuck in these abstract ways that we're so disconnected from people, right? Like the person who has the job, the person who lives in an area that's going to get flooded, the person who, loses their livelihood or whatever it might be. And instead we look at these like forces and weather and all this kind of stuff. And what you're saying is actually centering it back on that person, on people. So
I think in a way, it's kind of an obvious point, but we did all this analytics behind it. And so
it's always good to have the data.
We ran these and so imagine that you're making all these ads. And so one ad might have exactly the same story, but you have different images behind it. So for example, we have exactly the same story, but one image is a hurricane and the other image is a smokestack. Well, it turns out the smokestack actually gets people to care more than the hurricane. And so we do all these tests. And we looked recently at all the, like, okay, let me see the top 20 of the 500 tests. And then you look at it and it's like, oh, they all have one thing in common. They have faces, right? Not just people, but they got faces, and the faces are really close to the camera. And you can see people's eyes. So the closer you get, and then you give a person a name and a location and a story, it's just dramatically more effective than anything else. And we made a really bad ad about
on purpose.
There's people called donors. We make a lot of things that we spend media dollars on the ones that actually work. So we made one called the pace of innovation, and then we did a test with a mom just talking about what causes extreme weather and her concerns with the kids, and the second one was 8 times more productive. And so, and then maybe it's kind of obvious, but I have the analytical proof that when you look someone in the eye and you're really close to face, you actually make some progress.
Let me ask you, what are the findings of the work you've done that you've got the most pushback?
Oh, the most pushback.
Or the most hesitation of pressing that said button.
Yeah.
The juicy question.
The juicy question. Well, okay, I'm just going to go there. I think there's a necessary narrative in the political world about the job creation that comes from this big transition. And yet, test after test after test after test, it doesn't get people as animated as talking about things that they believe, right? Now, if you go really local, so if it's a job creation in a certain county, it works. But if you talk about it in an aggregate, like this is big economic transition, we get these jobs, and it comes from politicians, we talked about that before, it's not very productive. And so we asked 58,000 people, what's the reason that we should address climate change? And 3% of them said jobs and economic growth. And 12 times as many people said to take care of our kids. And so the data is just really clear that we've got to get really human and personal and direct and relevant. And politicians need to talk about economic growth. It's like part of the narrative that they need, but it only lands when it's local.
Yeah, it doesn't bang the way that they think it does.
It's interesting because it's like it's all about that, what people are thinking about first. Because obviously having a job is about providing for your family and your kids.
Yeah.
But the first thing you think about isn't I need a job. The first thing you think about is I need to provide for my family. Yeah. And then if you ask maybe how or in what way, then you might have like all of these other things. Yeah. But I guess it's what that first recall is, or that gut for people.
I think, and it can work, and it will work more. And there's battery plants going up, and in Michigan, there's lots of really exciting projects, and that you can get a lot of support for. But the concept of climate growth is a concept, and the way to sell climate change is a reality. And it's either a reality of this family that lost their home in a fire, or this, this person who doesn't have air conditioning for extreme weather. Like reality beats concepts on this thing. And I think we started on concepts, and now we got to get down to reality. And the thing is, there's so much reality to talk about now.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah. There's a lot going on.
So you've been doing this work now 3-4 years. What has been the most surprising thing that you've either experienced or found in your work?
The most surprising thing? Well, I think you can move people across the political spectrum. You can actually, it doesn't have to be
that is
a progressive
actually
issue.
Possible.
It's actually possible to do. And people are, I think, a little tired of all the political nonsense. And so if you do it the right way, you can actually get people of all shapes and sizes to care about it. And that's the hard thing. So we kind of need all of us, and that you can actually do that.
If people are talking about climate a lot in their lives, what could they take away from your work? Like 3 practical tips.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll do the 3 practical tips.
Go for it.
I mean, the simplicity, humanity, and accountability are like the 3 territories.
Simplicity, humanity and accountability.
And so practical tip number 1 is just use like just all the regular language. And so that basically means that when you have a press release from a climate organization, you need to rewrite it because it doesn't have any of that. So go for simplicity. I mean, humanity is like, what does the person on the other end care the most about? Turns out the most uniting message is our kids. And then accountability is about, we're all fighting polluters and pollution. And that's what climate is. So those tend to be the 3 guideposts that we use. I think that's the case for everybody. On the humanity one, I have a more specific tip, and I particularly tell this to political leaders and people in the climate sectors. Whenever you're talking about climate change, within 5 or 6 words, accompany it with a consequence, so that people so it become relatable. So the climate change that caused the flooding in Pakistan, the climate change that caused the dramatic overheating, the climate change that burned up Maui, the climate change that's increasing your air conditioning bills.
Not a future consequence, but something that has happened.
But stick a consequence in there, because climate change is kind of a loosey-goosey weird thing.
Yeah.
But nebulous. Make it the overheating and the floods, and make that there. And don't ever think that people are like, you got to activate that in people's heads, what they're actually thinking about.
Brilliant.
I think that's probably my big takeaway from this conversation. When you said that stuff about talking about pollution rather than talking about climate change, to me, that really sticks out as like talking about an immediate issue rather than something that's just a potential idea of what might happen in the future.
Yeah.
Because I think it really changes the way that people have to engage with the conversation, actually. Yeah. Really, really interesting.
Great.
What has been the most impactful or successful messaging that you've seen?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of the pieces of it. Having a really good messenger and talking about something that people really care about, and some messaging that comes from your community. We have one ad. You can go see it if you want. It's on ScienceMoms.com. It's called By the Time, and it's a story that traces a child growing up. And so it starts with a sonogram, and then it has when the kid's little. And
I have watched this ad, and it gets me like I'm in tears by the end of it.
And so you see the trajectory of all these images, and it says that our window to act on climate change is just like how they grow up. You blink and you miss it.
Oh my god!
And so it's just and so you, as the parent, you imagine this is the 20-year journey that my child goes through, and I'm taking care of them all the way through. But the thing that I can really take care of them to do is to get involved in climate. So that's one of our most effective things, and it definitely makes people cry. And we do find, like, because they think of their own kid when they see it, and they get emotional, and it makes them want to get involved. So that's our number one ad.
And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
Our listeners will know what this is, but this is basically where we get to ask you for your climate confession. Because when Ben and I started doing this work, it felt very much like you had to be perfect to do anything effective on climate. Yeah. And we are one interview at a time, shattering that.
Very far away from that concept.
Yeah. And so we want to know what your climate confession is.
They drive a 1965 MGB, but only 10 miles a year. But it's probably the dirtiest car on the road. I also have an electric car, but occasionally I get the other one out of the garage. And so I've debated swapping the engine out for an electric one, but I haven't done it yet because I like the noise.
I like the noise. That is you're that person driving past my window with the noisy car.
Luckily, the car cannot go more than 10 miles, and so my carbon emissions from the car are low.
Those are brilliant confessions. I like them. Very nice and specific. Ben, do you have a confession? It's been a while.
So my confession, this is soul destroying at this point. My confession this week is that I have had a really sore back and a really sore neck for the last fortnight, and so I've been having loads of baths to try and heat it up so I can to stretch out and stuff. But I have this really bad habit where I run a full bath and then I leave it for an hour and a half until it is not hot anymore, and then I let half of the water out and then fill it back up with hot water. So I'm wasting. Don't shake your head at me. I'm wasting. Sorry, Josie's shaking her head at me. I feel so judged, but I'm wasting a lot of water
and energy.
Yeah, and a lot of energy. So I need to fix that. But my back is not as sore anymore, so hopefully it will be resolved soon. Do you have one?
I mean, my ones will continue being the same. Flying is just my inevitable. Flying in business, particularly because it's quadruple my emissions. But whatever. I'm so resigned to it at this point. Like you were saying, the earlier about this, the guilt. For me, the guilt really is about flying. That's where mostly the guilt message fits in. So I think I've confessed to that 17 times on this podcast already. But John, this has been an incredible conversation.
Thank you so much.
It's really awesome to see this work that you're doing and that it's being so well received. And I think we're all going to be going into election years very soon in some of our respective countries. And so hopefully some of these effective messages will either politicians will stop talking or they'll get some effective messages and messengers and make this more of a priority.
Very good. Well, it's really good to be with you. I'm glad we finally did it.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the reviews section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Colter, artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus,
curation by Maryam Pasha,
mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshti,
music also by Ben Beheshti,
presented by Ben Hurst
and Maryam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.